Right, well, good evening, everybody. And this is my last session with you. I feel a bit like that, if I'm honest. I rather enjoy my little trips to Sloane Square on the tube and getting out. Now, we've looked at some Christian poets, and we've looked at variety of ages, times, and so on. John Donne and Herbert and Dickinson and Auden. And this evening, as it's the last session, I have been unashamedly indulgent, and I've just picked some contemporary or near contemporary poets who I enjoy. And I just want to introduce you to them. But the reason I want to introduce these particular poets to you is because, although many of them are not religious poets, there is something about their work that often draws people to use it for the great moments, the great times in life where you might say people are getting near to the realm of faith. And my PhD, which I won't bore you with here, but in summary, it was looking at whether in some way, in our day, where religious language is either faint, fractured, or frankly forgotten or never known, whether in some way poetry, particularly lyric poetry, and particularly what you might call epiphanic poetry, poems that have that little aha moment in them, whether those in some way are replacing religious language as a sort of vocabulary for the soul. And I won't bore you with my conclusions as to that, but it was a very interesting trawl through some poets which say there's a tragedy, you'll suddenly find they're being read. And if you go to a lot of contemporary buildings, for instance, the Cardiff Millennium Centre, the Scottish Parliament, a whole host of them actually, you'll find, the building that was built for the mayor opposite Tower Bridge, poems are often inscribed now on the outside of buildings and on the inside. And I was just very interested in why this is happening. What is it about poetry that is finding itself into the public arena? And so, for instance, when there was that terrible tragedy in Manchester, the person we were reading about the following day was the poet who was there, who captured something for that community. And you might remember the young woman poet who read at, was it Joe Biden's, putting in as president. She was the most memorable thing about the whole event. And sales rocketed. So what I've done is pick some poems where I'll try and show how I think they are touching what you might call a religious resonance, but not in overt religious language. And it means that quite often I use these poems with children, teenagers, people who are a bit suspicious about religion, but who are serious about the fact that human beings might have a purpose, or that there are things that matter, that life needs distilling and so on. And they warm to this sort of language, whereas if I'd just gone in and read the Apostles' Creed to them, that would have done nothing. So that's why I've chosen these poems. And I'm going to start with Wendy Cope. Now, Wendy Cope became quite famous. She was born in 1945. She's still alive. She lives in Ely. I know Wendy quite well because I met her when I was a curate at St John's Wood, and I went to a school where she was giving a reading of her poems. And a lot of them are short and quite funny, slightly acidic, particularly one period, if you're a man, you're going to find the acid coming your way. So things like that night, that night, it's gone straight out of my head. It will come back to me. She writes these small little poems that sound sort of childlike, but there's some sort of twist in them. I'll give you an example. This is a lovely little poem. It's not on the sheet. I just want you to listen to it. It's called Flowers. Some men never think of it. You did. You'd come along and say, you'd nearly brought me flowers, but something had gone wrong. The shop was closed, or you had doubts. The sort that minds like ours dream up incessantly. You thought I might not want your flowers. It made me smile and hug you then. Now I can only smile. But look, the flowers you nearly bought have lasted all this while. It's a typical Wendicote poem. And a lot of it is quite caustic, but also some of it is very tender. One of her poems was called Spared, was read out a lot after the 9/11. She is what you might call a pro-church agnostic in her outlook. She has of late started to write some poems that talk about church. There's one lovely one, which I won't read, out of great loyalty to our Archbishop, but slightly making fun of Justin Welby when she saw him on TV out jogging. So she even applies it a little bit caustically to religion. But there is also some tenderness in one or two of her religious poems. We're going to look at one of them. But I want to share with you, when I went to that reading, she read all these poems, and I'd never heard them before, so I was very excited by it all. And then she said, I want to read you now a poem about my grandmother. And I was brought up by my grandmother. And so my ears pricked up a bit. And she said, this is about my grandmother, and it's simply called Names. And if you look at your first poem, Names. She was Eliza for a few weeks when she was a baby. Eliza Lily. Soon it changed to Lil. Later she was Miss Stewart in the baker's shop. And then my love, my darling, mother. Widowed at 30, she went back to work as Mrs. Hand. Her daughter grew up, married and gave birth. Now she was Nana. Everybody calls me Nana, she would say to visitors. And so they did. Friends, tradesmen, the doctor. In the geriatric ward, they used the patients' Christian names. Lil, we said, or Nana. But it wasn't in her file. And for those last bewildered weeks, she was Eliza once again. So I listened to this poem. I actually found myself quite upset listening to it. You have found the fragile life cycle of a woman who you don't know, but you now feel rather tender towards. When I'm speaking to ordinands about preaching, I always remind them that this poem is 107 words. You can do remarkable things with just 107 words. You don't need 107 points on an overhead projector, and you don't need 107 minutes. But this poem I've often used with teenagers when we're talking about baptism and why names matter. And, who are you through your life? And which is the real you? And all these different names that she gets through her life. You know, where is her true name and identity? But you can see, I think, when I read that, I was hooked. And she's written a few collections. They're all quite short poems on the whole. And as I say, many of them are funny. I've just remembered that poem. The night he left was terrible. That night she went through hell. His absence wasn't the problem, but the corkscrew had gone as well. So you do get little poems like that. And then she's moved. She used to live in Winchester, and now she's moved to Ely. She often attends Evensong, and here on page 3 is her cathedral carol service. This is a little bit too painful for you to read now that I'm working. Those of us who are not important enough to have places reserved for us, and who turned up too late to get a seat at all, stand in the nave aisles or perch on stone ledges. We shiver in the draught from the west door. We cannot see the choir, the altar, or the candles. We can barely see the words on our service sheets. But we can hear the music, and we can sing for the baby whose parents were not important enough to have a place reserved for them, and who turned up too late to get a room at all. It's one of her poems that's slightly sort of veering towards reflecting on faith and church. There's a lovely poem she also wrote about a Christmas tree, which is about bringing the sort of life of the tree into the house, which I think also has some overtones of faith. But we're not talking Christian poetry here, but we are talking quite often about poems that have that aha, that epiphany, that little ooh. So when you hear the Names poem, you suddenly, I mean, this brings back lots of memories for people with their own families that have been through dementia, but it also brings back, you know, your own fragility, your own life cycle. And I think her work does that for a lot of people. And she's not just a clever, witty. She's sometimes put down, I think, by some critics as being a little bit sort of too easy, a bit sort of Enid Blyton. But I commend her work to you because I don't think it is that. It just often has easy forms. It's easy to read. But yeah, that's Wendy Cope. And that's why she's first, because I suppose hearing her, when I went to hear her, I suddenly realised I needed more poetry in my life. And I often say that to her, that it was at that reading that I suddenly realised I wanted to dive a bit deeper with poems. And she's still going, and she's married to a poet called Lachlan McKinnon, who is a wonderful man too. So that's Wendy Cope, but if you go to a lot of memorial services now, or if you go to big events where people are thinking about life or death, or particularly about the environment, another poet emerges a lot, and this is Mary Oliver. Mary Oliver isn't contemporary, but not too far. She died in 2019. She was born in 1935, American. Lived for a long time in Cape Cod, in that part of the world. And when she died, Time magazine, she was very famous in America, Time magazine said this was the woman who helped us all stay amazed. Not a bad thing to have on your tombstone. And I think that's the appeal of her poems, that idea that you ought to stay amazed. She wrote an essay just before she died called Going Upstream. And she talks about this day she was out with her parents. She said she was about 7 or 8, and they're going down the river. They're walking down one of the rivers. And she suddenly turns and she goes upstream and leaves them. And she says, going that way, she suddenly saw the light falling in a different way. She suddenly saw the water, the flowers, she heard birds. She was now by herself, of course, parents. And she said, I became lost. But if that's being lost, she said, let me be lost forever. There was something about her encounter with nature that she never forgot. And all her poems, really, in some way, are built on this idea that if you pay attention, attention will pay you back. And she used to go out every morning into the watery spaces near her home, into the forests, into the glades, with a notebook and a pen very early in the morning. And that's often how she would make her notes, which she then used to write her poems. And I do think this is probably one of the draws to her today, that the environmental, the nature aspect of her work, of course, is a very popular one for lots of reasons. And I think people feel that's a very easy way into that sense of the world as gift. She has a very strong sense that the world is a gift. And she always has, no, not always, but very often has, a little twist at the end saying, so what are you going to do about it? Which, of course, I think is also almost like a religious call to you to wake up, to open your eyes to this gift. So here's an example called The Summer Day. I think this is a typical Mary Oliver, and I'm going to ask you to have a quick chat with your neighbour after this to see what you make of it. The Summer Day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean. The one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last, and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Do you just have a quick word with your neighbour about that poem as to what your response to it is? Does anybody here like this poem? What do you like about it?
Very, very present.
In the present, yeah.
And she's solitary but not lonely.
Solitary but not lonely. That's a beautiful description of her, I think. Yeah.
The sentence that caught our eyes, or the part that caught our eyes, was the two lines, tell me, what is it you plan to do?
Yes.
Planning with your one wild and precious. Wild and precious, almost in opposition.
Do you see yourself as wild and precious?
Not really. It has to be a bit precious, a bit similar.
I think you have to be a bit wild too.
I think we thought that it doesn't quite fit. It would be if she suggested just take things as they are,
Yeah.
really accept things. That's not something you plan for.
No.
So why does she say that? Obviously for a reason.
Yeah. Can you see why some people who, there's a sort of person today that people dressed like this meet a lot who say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual.
Yes. Yes, it does.
People who actually often think the church is too secular, too much like what they're trying to get away from, too organisational, too hierarchical, too compromised, too boring. So quite often, people who feel like that, spiritually serious people who find the church to be too secular or too off-putting, often find this sort of poem is touching something in them. And those questions, of course, she's asking, isn't she? Who made it? Who made it? I don't know what prayer is, but... And I think that's capturing a lot of what's in the air at the moment. Is, I'm not sure if there's a God or not, but I don't want this world to go under. Because look at it, it's amazing. Let's watch that another David Attenborough program, and you'll see again how amazing it is. Who made the bear? And I can see why it's a draw, I think. Anything else about this poem? Something you didn't like, maybe?
I think there's something rather childlike about it. And it reminded me of when I was little and I used to go make nests in the lay fields,
Yeah.
the high grass,
Yeah.
and sit and look. And it took me straight back to that, the temperature child, not rushing around, just being.
Some people might say she's a bit sentimental, bit saccharine. No? No? Let's look at another typical Mary Oliver. This is called The Sun. Have you ever seen anything in your life more wonderful than the way the sun every evening, relaxed and easy, floats towards the horizon and into the clouds or the hills or the rumpled sea and is gone? And how it slides again out of the blackness every morning on the other side of the world like a red flower streaming upward on its heavenly oils, say on a morning in early summer at its perfect imperial distance. And have you ever felt for anything such wild love? Do you think there is anywhere in any language a word billowing enough for the pleasure that fills you as the sun reaches out, as it warms you as you stand there empty-handed? Or have you too turned from this world? Or have you too gone crazy for power, for things? Similar sort of style, asking us to observe, to pay attention to your feelings in response to nature, ending with a question. Is this poem as successful as the first one?
No.
Why? You've all become poet critics now, of course. I expect to know why.
I think it's the distance between the questions and the observation, the natural.
Yeah.
There was a bit of it. I think the one problem I love the grasshopper and all that,
Yes.
and produces huge resonances. But the actual questions she comes up with, they're pretty far away in the previous one, and they're very far away here.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, the poem could have ended with, as you stand there empty-handed, maybe.
They're good questions, aren't they? But,
Yeah. Yeah.
Some sermons says like this.
Sorry?
Some sermons says like this.
Yes. Yes.
Not. I always think not too well, really.
No, well, the Anglican poem is supposed to be three easy points and a poem, and then you finish. But yes, I see what you mean.
You can't receive if your hands are full.
No. And of course, the ancient Assyrians' word for prayer was the same word they had for unclenching a fist. So we tend to think often as prayer as I want. But for them, it was exactly the opposite. It was trying to prise your hand open. So the empty-handed also, of course, is a very prayerful image. The story of St. Kevin, for instance, when he's praying with his hands open so long that the blackbird hatched in his hand. So the empty-handedness is prayerful, but it's not saying it's prayer. And I think that's attracting people. She does have a very strong sense of love and tenderness, although I don't think she is too sentimental about nature. There's a lovely poem which always makes me laugh, where she goes down to the sea, and the sea, and she sort of says, "Oh, what am I going to do with my life? You know, oh, my misery and all this." And she says, the sea just said, "Excuse me, I've got work to do." It's just sort of. So there's a sort of indifference of nature towards her. But there is a tenderness quite often. And in this little poem called In Praise of Craziness of a Certain Kind, I'm trying to find the grandmother. This is the running theme today again. And it's rather appropriate as you've just become a grandmother in the last 24 hours. In praise of craziness of a certain kind. On cold evenings, my grandmother, with ownership of half her mind, the other half having flown back to Bohemia, spread newspapers over the porch floor. So, she said, the garden ants could crawl beneath as under a blanket and keep warm. And what shall I wish for myself, but being so struck by the lightning of years, to be like her with what is left, that loving. Again, another theme that she often will draw back to, you know, and again, I think that's a very a draw to her work. Is the unapologetic way she brings us back to that loving. I like that, struck by the lightning of years. Okay. I want now to think about another poet called Jo Shapcott, who's working in London. She teaches at the Royal Holloway, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her after you've had a quick word or two with each other about this poem on page 6. Jo Shapcott was born in 1953, and this poem is called Procedure. And when you're talking with each other, you might want to talk about the title as well as the poem itself. Procedure. This tea, this cup of tea made of leaves, made of the leaves of herbs and absolute almond blossom, this tea is the interpreter of almond, liquid touchstone, which lets us scent its true taste at last, and with a bump, in my case, takes me back to the yellow time of trouble with blood tests and cellular madness, and my presence required on the slab for surgery, and all that mess I don't want to comb through here, because it seems, honestly, a trifle now that steam and scent and strength and steep and infusion say thank you, thank you, thank you for the then and now. See what you make of that with your neighbour. Anybody like this poem? Yes. Okay. So what are we making of this poem?
We would take it back immediately to Marcel Proust's À la recherche. Yes, the importance of remembering. Because instead of being taken back to happy times in Combray, with Aunt Leonie.
Yeah.
Jo Shacknott was taken back to the time when she had this treatment.
A lot of us didn't understand it, if I'm honest.
Okay. Are you getting there, or would it be helpful just to sort of start to look at it a bit, just to spell out one or two
It's
things?
just what it's actually saying. I didn't hear all that you said. Were you explaining what it said?
I was saying that it reminded us of Marcel Proust's concept of involuntary memory, which develops in à la recherche du temps perdu. Such it was.
So, a smell or a taste can
Yes.
take you back.
Yes.
Here, when I tried to use this, in fact, it's printed in my book, which I will leave to just look at. When I printed this poem in this book, and the proofs kept coming back 3 times, putting a full stop after that. There is no full stop in the poem, because the point is now no closure. So, this person is presumably drinking some tea, and this steam, scent, infusion, strength is bringing some memories back. She talks about the yellow time. Are we to think that this is when her skin was yellow? When she was on a slab? Cellular madness, that's sounding like cancer. And she was there for surgery. And she calls all that mess that I don't want to comb through here, because it seems a trifle now that this moment, this beautiful moment, and she had cancer, and it stopped her writing poems for 10 years. And she now says that, and when I once talked about this, there was a cancer patient in the room with us who said, actually, when I started to have my chemo, the first thing I lost was my smell. And here, she's come through it. She can now appreciate again this tea with its scent and strength and infusion. And all she wants to say is a continuous thank you for the then and now. And I think in many ways it's a very Eucharistic poem, because Eucharist, of course, means thank you. I mean, it's thank you, thank you, thank you for the then and now. And it's being done over a cup. There are some overtones to it. But some people find the poem a bit melancholic. Some people find it very uplifting. I mean, I don't know what you made of it in that way, or whether you... Did you notice the lack of full stop at the end?
Yes. And presumably the smell of the almond is actually reminding me of something unpleasant, because it's something to do with some peculiar smell in the hospital or surgical environment.
Maybe.
So it's got a bit of a sting in it, actually, hasn't it?
And it lets us scent its true taste at last. So it's like her taste has gone, has not been there for a while, and now it's back. And those thank yous are continuous. There's no punctuation stopping them. It's just one running thank you.
The lack of a full stop at the end could almost make the last slide read, say thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you to that. And now.
And now, and thank you, that's very good. And the title as well, Procedure, is often what you call a medical procedure, but you're also, it could be seen as proceeding. This is my procedure in life. I've been, now I'm proceeding.
Is the thank you, thank you, thank you a religious sentiment from the poem?
I think that is at the heart of religious faith, isn't it? The sense of of gratitude, the sacrament of the present moment, where you just say, again, the empty hands. Yeah. Anyway, there is Jo Shapcott, and I commend her work to you. She has started writing poems again. This was one of the first poems she wrote after having been through all her chemotherapy for a number of years. Seamus Heaney is a very famous poet. In fact, he's known in the poetry world as Famous Seamus. And of course, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He died in 2013. If you don't know his poems, I really do commend them to you. I think he's a marvellous poet. Two little things that he said about poems, which I think I would like to pass on to you. The first is he says that the poet is on the side of undeceiving the world. So the poet is trying to help the world undeceive itself. He had a very strong sense of that, I think. He also at one point says, he talks about the story in John's Gospel of the woman caught in adultery. And he says, there they all are, the men are standing around saying, look at this whore, what she's done, and discussing what should happen to her, and trying to find out what Jesus is going to say about it, and they're all sort of getting themselves into a lather about it. And what does he do? Jesus stoops down and doodles on the ground. And he says that's what the poet does. And the noise of now is trying to get you all, caught up in a whirl of whatever it is, hate or self-righteousness or judgment. That noise of the now, the poet doesn't join in, but just draws a line in the sand. And he said, I think it was actually, he might have used that in his Nobel Prize speech, I can't remember, may not have been, but he actually says, that's how you know Jesus was a poet, really. He was able just to stoop down and wait till they finished and then say, of course, what he said. Well, don't see wrong without sin. You pass the first one. Here's a nice little poem, I think, not terribly well known, called Postscript. And again, because we've been looking at a few environmental poems, I thought this might fit the bill. And sometime, make the time to drive out west into County Clare, along the flaggy shore, in September or October, when the wind and the light are working off each other, so that the ocean on one side is wild with foam and glitter, and inland among stones the surface of a slate-grey lake is lit by the earthed lightning of a flock of swans, their feathers ruffed and ruffling, white on white, their fully grown, headstrong-looking heads tucked or cresting or busy underwater. Useless to think you'll park and capture it more thoroughly. You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass, as big soft buffetings come at the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open. I think a lot of his poems try to catch your heart off guard and blow it open. I think it's a nice little summary, I think, of what he sets out to do quite often. But again, if you've never come across Seamus Heaney, there is something for you to do in Eastertide, is to buy a little collection of his, and his essays are also very illuminating. But picking up the swan theme, and swans do have a religious mythology built around them because they're supposed to be the largest flying bird that is at home both in the air and in the water. Hindus often look at the swan because even though it's immersed in the world, the water just drips off. So they're in the world but not of it. So that you get contaminated by the water, the swan. And also, of course, I think it's St. Hugh, isn't it, who is supposed to have had a pet swan who went around with him when he was a bishop, and the swan was supposed to keep away all his enemies. Might book one for one or two bishops I know. Well, picking up the swan theme, here's Owen Shears, who's a Welsh poet born in 1974. And I will ask you to have a couple of words about this poem. I love this poem, by the way, so you don't have to, but I think it's rather lovely. Winter Swans. The clouds had given their all. 2 days of rain and then a break in which we walked, the waterlogged earth gulping for breath at our feet, as we skirted the lake, silent and apart, until the swans came and stopped us with a show of tipping in unison. As if rolling weights down their bodies to their heads, they halved themselves in the dark water. Icebergs of white feather paused before returning again like boats righting in rough weather. They mate for life, you said as they left, porcelain over the stilling water. I didn't reply, but as we moved on through the afternoon light, slow stepping in the lake's shingle and sand, I noticed our hands that had somehow swum the distance between us and folded one over the other like a pair of wings settling after flight. Have a quick word with your neighbour about that poem. Who likes this poem? Yeah.
I got to like this.
You got to like it.
It's like she interpreted.
Anything about it that you've learned? What do you like about it?
Well, they made up, they had a ra
Well, yes, they've fallen out in
or
some
something.
I always think that line, they mate for life, could have been said in two ways. They mate for life. Yes, but then you might have understood why they've
Then
fallen out.
instinctively they held hands.
Yeah,
I don't think their minds did, that's good.
yeah,
Instinctive.
yeah. A tender poem?
Yes.
Very clever.
It's such a lovely poem. I don't quite understand that phrase, porcelain over the stilly water. It seems a bit
Yeah.
very precious and totally shut in there.
Yes, you're not the first to say that they think that's the weakness in the poem, that bit.
Really.
Porcelain over stilling water. I think that stilling water is the image that you first pick up about what's happening to them.
Yes.
Something that's been churned up is starting to still.
Yes.
But, yeah,
That's the thought, is the poem about reconciliation?
yeah,
Yes.
I think so. And finding yourself reconciled, coming back to who you were in some way after some fallout, or, as I say, I don't think Andrew heard this, but I was just saying the line, they mate for life, could be, they mate for life. You know, you don't, but they do. Or it could just be a lovely observation. They mate for life.
Or as a reminder of what they were possibly going to lose.
Yeah. I read this poem once, and a woman, when I finished it, a woman cried out, crying, "That's my husband." And he died about a year before, apparently. And there was something about this poem that just brought him. I didn't ask what, but you never quite know what a poem's going to do. And I wasn't expecting that.
It's another beautiful sounding line, so that's slow stepping
Yes.
on the lake shingle and sand.
Yes.
Sounds-
Yes. Right, so I'm going to not look at Kai Miller. I want you to, that's your bit of homework. Kai Miller, born 1978, a Jamaican poet, brought up in a very religious family in Jamaica, and I'd love you to read those 2 poems sometime over the next few days by yourself. If you move now to page 10, we see a poem called Prayer by Zafar Kunyal, who is a contemporary poet with an English mother and a Kashmiri father, born in Birmingham. And this poem is written in response to a George Herbert poem. So what I'll do is I'll read the Herbert and then I'll read this. And this is a very famous George Herbert poem. It's actually a sonnet where he overlaps lots and lots of images in trying to describe prayer. Prayer, the church's banquet, angels' age, God's breath in man returning to his birth, the soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage, the Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth, engine against the Almighty, sinner's tower, reversed thunder, Christ's side-piercing spear, the 6 days' world transposing in an hour, a kind of tune which all things hear and fear, softness and peace, and joy and love and bliss, exalted manna, gladness of the best, heaven in ordinary, man well-dressed, the Milky Way, the bird of paradise, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, the land of spices, something understood. Prayer. First heard words delivered to this right ear. Allahu Akbar, God is great, by my father in the Queen Elizabeth maternity ward. God's breath in man returning to his birth, says Herbert, is prayer. If I continued his lines from there, from birth, a break Herbert chimes with heaven and earth, I'd keep in thought my mum on a Hereford hospital bed and say what prayer couldn't end. I'd say I made an animal noise, hurled languages hurt at midday when word had come, cancer. Now so spread by midnight her rings were off. I stayed on at her bed. Earlier, time and rhythm flatlining, I whispered, thank you, I love you, thank you. Mouth at her ear. She stared on, ahead. I won't know if she heard. The interesting thing about this response, I think, is you could read this as a very sort of agnostic, even atheistic response, and yet there is something, again, with the thank you, I love you, the talk of God is great at the beginning, but she stared on ahead. Is it ahead beyond what we can see? Is it that sort of ahead? She's going on a journey. But then, of course, the admitting, I don't know. I don't know if she heard me. But there is, for some people who read this response to Herbert's poem, something not as negative as the first reader might think. And I'm not going to press you on that tonight, but it's just something that I wanted you to see how sometimes a contemporary poet can write something in response to a poem, say, 400 years ago, interestingly still calling it prayer.
There's nothing negative about it.
No, you don't think so?
Nothing.
No.
Extraordinary.
Yeah. I love the idea of the father whispering in the baby's ear and then the son whispering in his mother's ear at the end.
And you read it so well. Her rings were off. I stayed on.
Yes. Yeah.
Extraordinary.
Yeah. He is an up-and-coming poet. He's just published his second collection. I think his poems are wonderful, actually. A lot of them are caught up with language because he he brought up speaking English and his father's language as well. And so he never quite feels at home in any language, which is perfect for the poet. I want to end with R.S. Thomas, who many of you will know, priest in the church in Wales, poet. You could go and visit where he was a vicar in Aberdaron on the Llyn Peninsula. You can go every year now to the R.S. Thomas Festival. He is read by lots of clergy, particularly in sermons, but I think a lot of clergy have been helped by his poetry quite often. I have to say that I was asked to speak about 3 years ago at the R.S. Thomas Festival, and they put me on with Rowan Williams, which, you know, is just, that is your gig nightmare. And then they said, oh, could you do a dialogue together? So I'm sitting there with him, and the Q&As happen, and remember, this is a festival of people who love R.S. Thomas. And one man put up his hand and said, Dr. Williams, was R.S. Thomas a good preacher? And he said, well, I have to say, I've never heard R.S. preach. I can't answer that question. And all of a sudden, the man at the back said, oh, Elsie here was in his congregation. She'll tell you. So this was Elsie's moment, you know. and Rowan said, you were in R.S.'s congregation? Oh, yes, she said. And you heard him preach? Oh, yes, every Sunday. And Rowan said, what was he like? And she went, oh, dire. It's a beautiful Welsh two-syllable, dire. And we all thought, thank God he was bad at something. But known for being a bit grumpy, granular, flinty in his approaches to God and to his parish sometimes. He once said that retirement had been given him by God to repent of all his sermons. So perhaps Elsie was on to something. But a very, very popular poet, and Seamus Heaney once called him the Clint Eastwood of the spirit. It's as if he swings into the bar and says, okay, go on, pick up your guns. That sort of relationship. Here is a poem he wrote after going to a concert with the violinist Kreisler, the musician. And I'm reading it because of what's coming our way over the next few days. A memory of Kreisler once, at some recital in this same city, the seats all taken, I found myself pushed onto the stage with a few others, so near that I could see the toil of his face muscles, a pulse like a moth fluttering under the fine skin, and the indelible veins of his smooth brow. I could see too the twitching of the fingers caught temporarily in art's neurosis, as we sat there or warmly applauded this player who so beautifully suffered for each of us upon his instrument. So it must have been on Calvary, in the fiercer light of the thorn's halo, the men standing by, and that one figure, the hands bleeding, the mind bruised but calm, making such music as lives still, and no one daring to interrupt, because it was himself that he played, and closer than all of them, the God listened. If you turn over, you'll also see he wrote quite a lot of poems about sitting in his church, the empty church. They laid this stone trap for him, enticing him with candles as though he would come like some huge moth out of the darkness to beat there. Ah, he had burned himself before in the human flame and escaped, leaving the reason torn. He will not come any more to our lure. Why then do I kneel, still striking my prayers on a stone heart? Is it in hope one of them will ignite yet and throw on its illuminated walls the shadow of someone greater than I can understand? Very beautiful, honest approach to his spirituality, I think. As I say, a very popular poet, and I did meet him twice, and everybody told me he was everybody used to say, oh, he's a grumpy old bugger. That's what they used to say, oh, he's a grumpy old. And I was scared about meeting him, and when I met him, nobody could have been nicer. He was absolutely disarmingly kind. But that was not everybody's experience. But as I say, he still has quite a following. And again, if you don't know his work, I commend his work to you. So as we come to an end, I think I once said right at the beginning about Wallace Stevens' image of the children should like poetry, like humans ought to like poetry the way children like the snow. The way that when snow falls, it just completely changes the landscape. Everything you thought you knew has disappeared. And you have to make another path, and you see your own breath in the air. And these are the things, I think, that poems can do at their best, is they help you pull back the curtains and see a reimagined landscape, not only out there, but in here. And it helps you see your breath, it helps you come in touch with yourself. It also sometimes asks you which path you're going to make for yourself now, particularly like Mary Oliver. What are you going to do with your one wild and precious life? And Les Murray, who a very popular, in many ways, Australian poet, he once said that religions are slow, big poems. And poems, he said, are short, fast religions. And I think what he meant by that is that there is something poetic and big about religion and faith. Something that is drawing us. But also there is something beautifully intricate and drawing to about these little short poems that can make you go, oh. And that also is asking us to pay attention. He says in one of his poems, Les Murray, and if I were to have anything, if I was to create a chapel in the cathedral that I work in, don't put it about that I'm going to, by the way, they get all very excited about it. But if I was, I would put these words by Les Murray over the altar, which he simply said this: God is in this world as poetry is in the poem. I love that. God is in this world as poetry is in the poem. And I think with that image, I'll leave you and wish you a very happy and fruitful Holy Week and Easter when it comes. Thank you very much.